In his memoir, My Father's Brain, Life in the Shadow of Alzheimer's, physician Sandeep Jauhar recounts his father's decline into dementia.
The knowledge I gained helped me to enter my father's world. It helped me to bridge, if only partly, the gap between us, one I had struggled to cross in one way or another my whole life. Still, it was probably the hardest journey I have ever taken.
That journey included family drama and debates about the best way to care for his father. Hello, it's Victoria from HEC Books, where we talk with authors who take us beyond their bestsellers and into their writing world. If you're new to our channel, make sure you subscribe for more great content like this. Now, let's find out why Dr. Jauhar changed his mind on how to talk to his father as the quiet man he knew began exhibiting bizarre behaviors. Much of what you and your siblings went through with your father, and he had 7 years of this decline.
That's right.
You really mirror other families, and it becomes a much bigger debate within not only our lives, but the medical community about how to best treat dementia patients.
Right.
You go there big time, and it creates this philosophical, many questions about end of life. You believed it was, and treatment was in terms of how to treat your father, how to react to him. You believed it was best to be honest and more straightforward and more in his best interest not to lie to him, as your siblings kind of like,
Yes.
just go with him. It's okay to maybe tell a fib, to go with whatever his mindset is. Did your experience caring for him, as well as research and reporting you did for the book, change your belief about what is known as therapeutic deception?
Well, so let me just step back and explain the dynamic. So as a physician, I was trained in a paradigm where you level with patients.
Right.
You tell them the truth. By the way, a generation ago, doctors were very often being paternalistic and not really leveling with patients, withholding bad news. But the world has changed. And now it's all about patient autonomy, informed consent. And so I kind of imported that way of being, that way of practicing to my father's situation. So when he would say things like, the caregiver, Harvinder, should not be paid. She should just work here and live here, for free and for just room and board. I would say, Dad, you know that doesn't work in this world. You have to pay someone who's working for you. And that would really upset him. And so my siblings, my sister and my brother definitely would say, well, just tell him that she's not being paid. And I would say, that's short-sighted because, he's still there. I believed he was still there. He could still understand. And he knows that people don't work for free. Right. And so if you keep telling him this, and moreover, when he discovers that we are lying, it's going to compromise his trust in us. So I would say, look, we need to tell him the truth. They would say, no, we need to tell him what he wants to hear to prevent anguish. It really became a big deal after my mother died, because he would ask about her. Yeah. Where's your mom? Yeah. And I would say, Dad, Mom died. Right. And I've told you this before, and nothing we say or do is going to bring her back. Right. And it would cause him incredible anguish. And I'd say, Dad, we need to face that fact. Right. My brother would eventually would say things like, Mom's, on a plane flying here. She'll be here shortly. And he'd say, well, get her on the phone. And my brother would say, she's on the plane. You can't call someone on a plane, right? And he'd say, oh, yeah, right. And then he'd kind of forget.
And it goes to something you mentioned in the book, but you're over in the Netherlands.
Yes.
And fascinating that you visit this community, I guess you call it, of folks suffering from dementia.
Yes.
But they practice this
sort of therapeutic deception.
Yes.
Right.
And so you had this conversation with this doctor, but I thought it was so great for people to read.
I think the conundrum for caregivers is, do you lie or you tell the truth?
Right.
And, for me, initially, telling my father the truth was like saying to him, you're still a part of my world.
Right.
And you still deserve to be treated with dignity. And for me, treating someone with dignity is telling them the truth, leveling with them. Eventually, I came to understand that there's a different and maybe larger conception of dignity, which is validating someone's reality, validating someone's orientation, not constantly trying to bring them into your own or what the world says is reality and causing them anguish in the process.
At one point, you did have surveillance cameras, this is after your mother's passed, set up around the home so the caregiver, well, your dad gets caught on camera just basically throwing fits of rage and towards her, which would, then he would deny doing it minutes later. Yeah. So tell us about your meeting with St. Louis neurologist Dr. Gregory Day from WashU and how he helped you understand your father's being unaware of how he acted. Because you would get frustrated. You're like, but Dad, you just did this seconds ago.
Yeah.
And yet he seemed completely unaware.
Even for a doctor like me, I didn't really know what was going on in the brain. And so that lack of understanding caused incredible frustration for me. So I would think my dad was putting me on.
Right.
You know, like, we just talked about this. You did throw orange juice at her face, or you did try to hit her with a wire hanger, and you admitted that you did. And now what's going on here?
And this was out of character for your father. So for those who are watching and don't understand this, and then here you are, a son, watching this unfold. Yeah. So for loved ones, it's got to be, it's a jaw dropper.
He was
scary.
The most mild-mannered man, scientist, an intellectual.
Yes.
He would never, ever have behaved this way.
Right. So why is anger seems to be it can be a common characteristic when you develop dementia?
Well, that's part of what the book is about, is explaining what's going on in the brain. So Alzheimer's tends to start in the part of the brain that encodes memory. That's why people forget what they had for lunch. But then the part of the brain that sort of processes emotions is right next to the part of the brain that encodes memory. The memory part of the brain is called the hippocampus. The emotional part of the brain is called the amygdala. So Alzheimer's tends to start in the hippocampus. It moves to the amygdala, so people initially have memory problems, then they develop behavioral disturbance, anger, emotional instability, and then eventually the disease, moves, extends out, and eventually starts to affect the parietal lobes, and that's where Dr. Day at WashU explained to me is where sort of self-awareness lies. So neurological disease is so different than physical disease because your understanding of the disease can be impaired by the disease itself, right? There's a sort of meta consciousness. Right. And, we know what we're doing. We're aware of ourselves. But what was really surprising to me is that he said that there are parts of the brain that encode that awareness. And so when they get affected, people lose a sense of that they're impaired, that they have problems. It's a condition that he called, and I remember this from medical school at WashU, it's called anosognosia. And it's a phenomenon that is shared by other brain diseases, schizophrenias, for example. Schizophrenics very often don't know that they have schizophrenia, that they're psychotic. People with OCD very often don't understand that they're being obsessive. And the same thing with dementia. My father didn't know that he was impaired. He knew it early. When he first developed memory problems, he'd say, wow, I didn't remember that. That's strange, But then he'd say, oh, not a big deal. I'm getting older. It's part of, it's part of just getting older. But as the disease got worse, he started to deny more and more that he had a problem.
Right. Yeah, and sadly, with your discussion with Dr. Day, he kind of also shared some grim news about treatments. He says there are no effective treatments for those who already have symptoms or anything to slow it down. Is that correct?
I spoke to Dr. Day, probably it was, 2018 or so.
Okay.
It was true then.
Okay.
Now, and I write about this in the book, there are new treatments for Alzheimer's that may be game changers. We don't know at this point. But, one of the long-standing issues with Alzheimer's is what causes it.
Right.
Is it inflammation, which causes a lot of other problems in the body, arthritis and liver disease and heart disease to some extent is inflammatory. Is it inflammation, or is it these misfolded proteins called plaques and tangles? And so for the longest time, after Alzheimer, the German psychiatrist, identified patients who had this condition of early dementia, and he looked at their brain slices under a microscope. He saw amyloid, and so for the longest time, the paradigm was amyloid equals Alzheimer's. So if you get rid of amyloid, you're going to improve Alzheimer's. Amyloid drugs didn't work, though, so it called the whole hypothesis into question. More recently, there are anti-amyloid drugs that have been developed that slow the decline of patients' dementia and their cognition. So I would say that there's still really no incredibly effective treatments, but there are some treatments on the horizon that create some hope.
Yes, that's good. We want hope. We all want hope, don't we?
You need hope,
yes,
especially with this disease.
Yes, and when you talk about the vascular abnormalities in the brain, the research you share actually shows that preventive care to lower the risk of developing dementia in the first place is similar, really, to things that we can do to help our heart as a cardiologist. Can you please explain some of these things that we could do in our everyday lives, even if we might have a history of dementia in the family?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of risk factors for developing Alzheimer's. One is just age, because with age come, various insults and injuries. One thing we know now is that along with the aging process comes vascular aging. Blood vessels start to get clogged up with debris, fatty plaque, and so on. And so some of the same risk factors for heart disease apply to Alzheimer's. So if we can sort of mitigate the process of heart disease by controlling diabetes, controlling hypertension, eating a healthy diet, some people would say a Mediterranean diet, exercising, and then keeping ourselves cognitively stimulated to increase cognitive reserve. If we can do all those things, so sort of targeting the heart part, but also the brain part, we can sort of mitigate the development of dementia.
Towards the end of the book, you mention the 7 stages of Alzheimer's, and you chronicle your father very briefly about where he was. Is it helpful as a caregiver to know where they are, or does it even matter?
It matters. Yeah. It 100% matters, because that's one of the messages that I'm trying to spread, is that the more understanding you have, the more of a script that you have, the better you can predict what's going to happen, the better you can be as a caregiver. You need to know that when your loved one is entering a different stage. When my dad had entered stage 6 of 7, I changed in my interactions with him. I knew the end was coming, and we don't always know that as caregivers. And so I think it's important to have an idea of the disease, the science of it, so that you can really be better, not only for the person you're caring for, but also with yourself, because caregiving is such a stressful experience.
Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it. And in part 3, Dr. Jauhar talks about the challenges of revisiting painful moments while writing as a loving son and weaving those into his research as a doctor.